Find it anyway nearly impossible to come to Parshat Noach this year as last year and not take note of the reason the Torah gives for the destruction of the world and the Mabul and the flood. It's found right away in the opening passages of the Parsha. V'tishachet ha'aretz lifnei ha'Elohim, the earth became corrupt before God. V'timalei ha'aretz chamas, and the world was filled with chamas. Now, just to remind us, because we've talked about this before, what does chamas mean within this context? Chaos, lawlessness, and so forth. We can look to some of our commentaries, and we see that Ibn Ezra, for example, says that Hamas is violence, theft, oppression, and the taking of women against their will. Ibn Ezra, 11th century, right? Midrash Agadah, which is even older, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Midrash Agadah says that another interpretation is lawlessness, that they were spillers of blood. Right? That Hamas were spillers of blood. That's 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Midrash Agadah trying to understand what Hamas is. And another Midrash Agadah from the same time period says that it was forbidden sexual relationships. That you have devoured my people's flesh. You have flayed their skin off of them. Right? Ancient Midrashim and commentaries, and yet it seems all too current and real. Why was the world destroyed according to the Torah? Why did God send the Mabul, the flood? V'timalei ha'aretz chamas, because the earth was filled with Hamas. Now, what does Hamas mean in Arabic? Who remembers? It's an acronym. I don't know the Arabic, so I'm not going to quote in the Arabic, but it's an acronym in Arabic that stands for the Islamic Resistance Movement. And it gets abbreviated as Hamas. Is this a coincidence? I don't think so. Even more so, I had an epiphany this week as I was thinking about this. What was the name that Hamas gave to their actions on October 7th? The Al-Aqsa flood. And where does the word Hamas appear within the Torah? At the flood. Now, I don't know if that's original to me. I don't know if Hamas actually named that action because of the connection between their names and the Parsha. But I gotta say, it's just really too close of a coincidence for there not to be some thoughtfulness on their part in terms of both their name and that action as if part of the psychological warfare that is being played out against the Jewish people. And so God destroys the world. And it seems for many of us today, because I know we're all talking about it at our dinner tables and wherever, because we're consumed by it, it seems as if the world is yet again at a moment of total destruction. Everywhere we look, there's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, there's the Houthis, there's the Iranians, there's antisemitism on campus. I mean, I was talking with Maurice just earlier today as her daughter Orly is checking out campuses, went to McGill and there was a protest and people on a ladder, you said, throwing smoke bombs over here and thinking about going to Barnard in Columbia in partnership with JTS. It just seems like, I'm waiting for the skies to open up and for another flood to come because it seems like the whole world has gone crazy with Hamas in the Middle East and Hezbollah and Iran and the so-called axis of resistance. And even here in the streets of Toronto, people celebrating Hamas and Hezbollah as if that's the new normative standard of resistance. So I'm waiting for the world for God to open up the skies again and for there to be a flood, because that's what happened last time, right? Hamas timalei haaretz filled the entire earth, and God said, enough. These human beings, we got to start over again. But that's not going to happen, because if we read later in the story, God realizes that you can't just destroy the entire earth every time people make mistakes. And so at the end of the flood, Noah exits the ark. Vayerach Adonai et reach hanichoach, and God smelled the pleasing odor of the sacrifice that Noah made, and made a commitment, a covenant. Vayomer Adonai el libo, and God spoke from his heart, or to God's heart. Lo osif lekalel od et ha'adama ba'avor ha'adam. I'm not going to destroy the entire world again because of human beings. Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra, because the devisings of the human mind are evil from their youth, that there's something in human existence that allows for, and maybe even has a propensity towards, destruction. But God promises, "V'lo osif od lahakot et kol chai kasher asiti." I will never again destroy every living being as I have done this time. Now, what is it that causes God to have that change of heart? Why is it that God, the first time Hamas appears and fills the whole world, God destroys the earth? Why is it that God's now saying, I'm not going to do that again? Well, from this biblical passage that we just read, it suggests that God's promise reflects an understanding of human imperfection, an acknowledgement of the persistence of our flaws, rather than an idealistic expectation of behavior. Some of our classical rabbinic interpretations, like Midrash Tanchuma, for example, suggest that God initially created humanity with the expectation of perfection. However, after the flood, God recognizes that we're flawed. And so God adopts a more merciful approach, aiming to guide and support us in our moral growth. Rashi explains that God's promise is not merely an expression of regret, but a covenant of restraint. Rashi interprets the rainbow, the keshet, right? A bow. Now think about this: a bow in the ancient world. What was a bow? We think about bows and arrows, right? So in the ancient world, in the age of chivalry anyway, when the knight would meet another knight on the field and they wanted to parley, this is where the handshake comes from. You come with your hands open and you have a handshake because it's a sign that there's no weapon in your hand. What's the symbol of a bow that you're coming to parley, that you're coming to talk and to have peace? The bow is upside down. If you meet your enemy in the field, you come with the bow upside down rather than prepared to use it. So the keshet, the rainbow, is an upside down bow, according to Rashi, aimed away from the earth as a symbol of peace. So the rainbow becomes the symbol of peace. By refraining from pointing the bow at humanity, God signifies a desire to prevent the world's destruction and instead encourage human repentance and moral progress. So what God is doing, according to these commentators, is turning the burden of responsibility from God as the creator to human beings as the flawed moral actors within the world. Ramban Nachmanides takes a more theological approach and suggests that the flood represented a purging of absolute corruption that had reached an intolerable level, and the post-flood promise, therefore, is a covenant to work within the natural world, promoting that moral growth rather than destruction. It underscores a divine commitment to sustaining creation, allowing humans to engage in repentance without fear of global annihilation. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, clearly reading Ramban, Nachmanides in this case, talks about the rainbow as a bridge between divine justice and mercy, representing hope and second chance for humankind. Abraham Joshua Heschel speaks of this moment as the beginning of divine empathy for humanity. Right, so God flips the script, so to speak. God recognizes an important element about human nature. It's as if God also recognizes and accepts, well, if I'm going to give this people free choice, then they have to be responsible for their moral growth, and I can't intervene again and destroy the world when they go off the reservation. That seems to be what's happening here. That's why God doesn't destroy the world again, because the responsibility for reigning in Hamas becomes a human responsibility. One that it appears anyway for too many of us in our day and age we've moved away from. Or have we? This is the difference between feeling, appearance, and reality. On Wednesday, I attended a commemoration for the events of October 7th at Queen's Park. It was sponsored by the province and by the Israel consulate. Speaking at that commemoration was Iris Weinstein Hagi, the daughter of Judith and Gadi. Judith is one of the 7 Canadians that was murdered or taken hostage. In her case, it was both. She was murdered on October 7th, and her body, as well as that of her husband's, remain in Gaza as hostages. As Iris said on Wednesday, they remain there as some sort of sick bargaining chip. But what was interesting about this commemoration were the number of provincial and local leaders that were there to participate in the commemoration. And what was also interesting, what dawned on me, is that in the last several months, it seems that we've been so defensive about the war and so immersed in the defense against genocide and suffering and so forth, that we've kind of forgotten about the hostages a little bit. And what Iris and Erin Kotler, who was the other speaker on Wednesday, especially Erwin, really tried to impress upon the audience was that the hostages should be the rallying cry of Canadians across the spectrum. There are 7 Canadians that were murdered or remain captive in Gaza, dead or alive. Iris grew up on those Canadian values and roots of compassion, selflessness, commitment to those in need. And what we need to do at this moment, she said, was to reaffirm our commitment to justice, to safety for all Canadian citizens, and to human rights. It's a national responsibility. It should be a Canadian national responsibility regarding her mother and the other 6 Canadians involved. She asked, where's the outrage? Where's the outrage? Why is it there's so few Canadians that know her name? That the taking of hostages and the keeping of them for 392, 393 days, whatever it is a violation of every human understanding of human rights, law, decency, morality, religious laws, and decency. Erwin Kotler noted that this was a historical inflection moment, a clarion call to act, where the redemption of the hostages is a standalone imperative. It's the first order, he said, of humanitarian and legal obligation and priority. And it's up to us and our allies to ensure that every level of government, local, provincial, federal, put the redemption of the hostages front and center on the international agenda. That, at the very least, should be something that all of us can agree on, regardless of our disagreements over the other intricacies and details of the law or of the circumstance. And he said, as all of our mothers have said to us throughout our lives, that ultimately the government, like each of us, are going to be judged not on what we say, but on what we do. When there is violence, Hamas, spread throughout the land, it is up to us, to human beings, as the actors in a post-flood world, to bring about redemption. That's the message. And if at times we seem to be overwhelmed and waiting for the flood to come and hit us, I want to share with you two important things that happened also this week that should give us a sense of hope. The first is Environics, the data research company in Canada that did the comprehensive study of Canadian Jewry in 2017, published this week the study of a finding of antisemitism in Canada from research that was based from last February. And what the research shows is that though antisemitism in the news and on our social media feeds feels like a flood, the truth is the story of antisemitism in Canada is much more nuanced. Much more nuanced. The vast majority of Canadians of every age are not anti-Semitic, and they're not anti-Zionist, and they're not anti-Israel. The noise that we hear is coming from about 4% of the population, whereas 30% of the population is squarely in support of Israel and in the Jews of Canada. It's a huge gap between them. It's just that 4% is the one that we encounter on the college campuses, right? The places where anti-Semitism seems to be running amok is the college campus, and unfortunately in the Muslim community. And there seems to be a correlation between Muslim immigration to Canada over the last decade and the rise of anti-Semitism. But even there, it's not so clear. That there seems to be a 50-50 split within the Muslim community about their feelings towards Israel and the Jews. And if that's the case, then it means that there's an opportunity with more moderate Muslims to build bridges. And we need to seek out those opportunities and build those bridges. There's also a study that was done, very comprehensive, that just landed on the desk of Federation on Thursday. Tuesday. It's not public yet, but that data is even more comprehensive than the one that Environics did, and it shows pretty much similar, at least on a cursory view, similar data. That there is a problem of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in Israel, anti-Israel in certain segments of the population, but it's much smaller than it appears. In other words, it's not Timale Haaretz. It's not spread out over the entire land. And that presents an opportunity. The other thing that happened this week, that at least a couple members of Beth Tzedec that I know of played a role in, is that Ambassador Deborah Lyons, the ambassador for combating anti-Semitism and for Holocaust remembrance, published the Canadian Handbook on the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Noah Liu, one of our generation members, was an advisor to it and actually did the yeoman's work of writing the text. And I was one of 150 advisors that were consulted on the contents of this handbook. But what this handbook represents is the official Government of Canada's handbook for government institutions, nonprofits, for-profits, DEI workplaces, everywhere, right? This is the official Canadian approach for how to identify and respond to anti-Semitism within Canada. Now, there is a huge challenge in that the IRA definition, though accepted by Canada, accepted by many of our provinces, accepted by many of our institutions, that's positive. The challenge is that it's voluntary. So how we work to convince those who have accepted the definition to actually start implementing the handbook, that's the challenge that we have. But the positive sign is we have a lot of institutions that have accepted the definition, and we now have a handbook authorized by the government to be implemented. That should give us a sign of hope. And all of these things that happened this week and many other things that are happening regularly should give us hope that Timale Haaretz, that the earth is not filled with Hamas, that we have understood to a certain extent God's challenge to us to be responsible for pushing away the violence, for pushing away the hate, for building bridges of peace. I don't want to minimize how hard any of this is. But this week at least, we received some data and some tools that give us an opportunity to fulfill that mission, to build rainbows rather than floods. We have to roll up our sleeves. We have to get to work. Shabbat Shalom.